It's us again. You know, the guys.
Yeah.
Today, we'll be discussing a pretty good movie. Or is it? The movie is called Dunkirk. It's a film about the Battle of Dunkirk in World War II.
So, do you want to kind of start us off with like a brief summary of the movie?
Brief summary. So, these guys on a boat. I don't remember their names. Christian, would you mind filling me in?
The names aren't that important. What's important is that it's World War II now.
Whoa, really? Are these people real?
Not really. Of course, soldiers were real, but most of the actual characters were just kind of representations of those soldiers' experience.
Awesome. These were effectively puppeteers for the director to create a more encapsulating experience. What I wanted to first bring up was the brutality of these fights that happened. Now, as we all know, World War II was pretty bad. Pretty bad experience all around. Now, there was especially one moment that I was looking into after seeing this film. It was in Les Paradis. It was effectively an encampment of about, I believe, 80 to 90 French soldiers that were being surrounded by German soldiers. They knew that they were losing, so they eventually tried to wave the white flag. This was near Dunkirk, by the BTW, by the way. And they were waving the white flag at the end of a bayonet to simulate surrender. But the German soldiers kinda didn't care. They were gunned down by machine gun fire. So in this battle, it was no real mercy was shown. Christian, do you have any other things related to the brutality?
No, I think that kind of sums up that whole experience. It was pretty terrible. And I think they kind of brought up something else that was kind of interesting that I found about the French efforts to leave Dunkirk, because the British weren't the only ones that tried to initiate that plan. There was actually a much less successful operation by the French to do the same. It only got around 75,000 soldiers, which, after a little bit of being held in Britain, were kind of sent back because the government had just said that they've already surrendered, so they don't really need to stay over there and keep fighting.
Do you know what this operation was called?
I'm not really sure since it is usually lumped in a bit with Dunkirk, so and because it wasn't as big, it's not really as public knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe something that the viewers or listeners could actually look into.
Yes, a source for you. Now, another big thing about this thing, about this battle. The battle itself. It actually relied a lot on civilians to get going. For transportation-wise, they had to get over the English Channel. That's a big gap. Now, military vessels, they only had so many. They only had a few French ones. They got a majority of the soldiers across by civilian ships, surprisingly. So, that's where we actually clue in on the film. Those civilian ships that grabbed soldiers and were bringing them back to the beaches were pretty crucial in order to transport and save soldiers.
Yeah,
Water
it was
break.
probably one of the biggest parts of that. One of the biggest reasons that our whole operation was successful. Couple that with the difficulty of actually trying to get something like a destroyer across the English Channel with constant firing from Nazi planes and the very shallow waters. It was not a very fun experience.
Mm-mm. Very yucky, especially with the low tides along the beach shores, not being able to get soldiers in close enough for them to land properly, and not being able to land close enough for soldiers to get on there because of the higher up ground and the low tides. Just actually awful for any military vessel.
Yeah. No wonder why the actual operation took a few days. There are stories of soldiers having to wait for 3 days without food or sleep, just trying to get onto any sort of ship that might come by. Some were so crazy, they actually decided they just might start swimming and then just eventually find one.
Hmm.
I believe that was even something referenced in the movie, right?
Yeah, there was a soldier that was like, "Nah, I'm out," and then just started kind of swimming away. The general was the generals actually stopped one of the other soldiers from helping him, saying, "Yeah, there's no helping him. He's gonna swim out there and find a ship or die trying." And honestly, that was a big deal. The soldier's psyche at this time was completely just ruined and collapsed with that amount of starvation, dehydration, and constant gunfire going on in the distance or even nearby, as we saw in the film as well. Them being dive bombed along the beaches by that airplane, leading into that brutality.
Yeah. I think that movie did a really good job just kind of showing those emotions of those people on the like on the pier and at Dunkirk's beaches, just kind of waiting for help and not really knowing much about what is even going on.
All those distant gunfire and such. This film actually
Yeah.
did something I really appreciate, similar-esque to Private Brian. Saving Private Ryan, not Brian. It was the constant gunfire. You effectively became numb to it throughout the film, where it kind of felt as commonplace as the background music, where you necessarily pointed out. Understood. Now, I'm not really sure if that was 100% intentional, but it's a thing that I noticed and quite appreciated, especially for these kinds of war movies and such.
Yeah, I always enjoy that, just like a little bit of exaggeration just to help you get into that sort of emotion. Like, of course, like it might not have been exactly how that went down, but like this sort of format of just like having that constant gunfire probably will give you a better feeling of what the soldiers had actually felt like, as opposed to what it might have actually looked like,
Mm-hmm.
which is equally as important in a war movie.
Indeed. Now, there's one scene in particular that I thought was really. I'm not really sure how to describe it. It was very extra. It was the scene with the oil spill and leading into fire, with a bunch of the soldiers effectively just burning up along the beaches. That scene had me delve into effectively a rabbit hole where I was looking into more and more of the actual events themselves and into the ships. Apparently, a lot of the currently sunk ships for World War II that were taken out by Japanese bombers still had a lot of oil because that's usually what they ran on, or some form of fuel. Now, the thing is that oil and fuel doesn't immediately disappear when the ship goes down, and as a result, since they're corroding there at the bottom of the ocean, they have effectively just been leaking oil up into the waters. One of these being the ship in Pearl Harbor, currently in Hawaii, where if you go out there, you can see just large globs of oil and fuel surfacing into the Bay Area. It's just a weird thing to think about. A lot of because usually when we think about the effects and results of a war, we think about all the weapons of mass destruction left over, or things of the minds and bodies of our soldiers, not necessarily the tools that they left behind.
Yeah. So I had a question. It sounds like a lot of those oil spills were particularly on the Pacific front. So do you think that using that for bow that was nowhere near that part, well, had really helped this movie and might even raise some awareness of that sort of event um, in a location where it might not have actually happened?
Would you mind repeating the question? I didn't understand it too well.
Just that it just sounds like a lot of the oil spills that you had talked about were more stuff on the Pacific front near like Hawaii and Japan. I'm just curious if you think that the use of it in a place completely separate from that, like the English Channel, was a good way to possibly get a bit more history content that might not have actually happened at the battle, and possibly even raise awareness for that sort of event.
I do think it was a good thing to include in the film, mainly because of the actual, not so much the exact content of specifically an oil accident leading into the death of many soldiers, more of the fact of those kinds of just results in war and accident, that general accident idea behind it, where like usually small slip-ups or something very minute leading into the deaths of dozens or hundreds of soldiers. Um, that just existing in the film alone, I think, is the main drive of why it was in there. However, I do appreciate the fact that it did also call some attention back towards the Pacific Front with the leakages in the ocean.
Yeah, but I have to agree with you. I really enjoyed this movie with like all of like the small details that were just kind of in there that might relate to something that's not as obvious about the war without having to go into like a full 5 minute explanation about what it means. Kind of like how at the end of the movie you're hearing them talk about like their grievances with the Air Force, because of course the Air Force couldn't get over to Dunkirk itself, so they couldn't actually see the work that they were doing over the channel the entire time and assumed they were just kind of sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
Or just the yeah.
The general attention and focus on the detail throughout this film is very apparent. And I do appreciate, I love it, really. I think that them adding so many different, just minute details that allow you to look into it yourself, sort of deal. Whereas kind of like where you make assumptions and effectively just get a general feel for the film rather than just outright historical content, similar to other war movies. Now, do I think that this film itself is very important very important in a historical context? I think that it is quite important. However, I do not think that this should be your only resource, since the film itself wasn't actually focused so much on the historical side of it, not really like displaying the actual events on the screen where people can more easily absorb it, similar to how other war movies go about it with like Berlin 2012, I don't know.
Naturally.
So I think that this, being a supporter to general understanding of World War II history, is a wonderful idea. Having this to get the idea and experience behind each individual person behind the war front itself would be very good for classes learning about World War II.
I actually think that this movie is like a very good example of a good war movie. And I don't mean that as like it gets all the details right. I mean like as a movie from Hollywood that's supposed to be entertaining as well as teach history, as opposed to something like Gettysburg where it just shows like a bunch of the battles and all of that. It just kind of puts in things that it needs for a story, while still kind of hinting at a lot of these historical contexts so you can still get an understanding of it without having too many misconceptions, while also make it seem interesting enough that you might want to go and do more research on it if you are so inclined. I think that's the kind of thing that most war movies should strive for, because of course you can't just have all movies be like a Schindler's List or a Saving Private Ryan where it's just covering so much. You can only get like a certain amount of content in there while still keeping it as a movie.
Well, all right. I think that this is the end of our podcast. I'm really happy that you were all able to tune in and hear us discuss this film. And stick around after the credits, and you'll see a funny man come by. Bye.
Bye.
Sorry, we were unable to get our surprise guest. However, here are some cool sound effects I found online.
Absolutely. Absolutely not. I suspected this could happen, but the administrator just would not listen. A fellow scientist. Ah, Freeman, do you think we should appeal to the alien authorities? Do you suspect some alien subterfuge behind this failure? Yes. This all looks nominal. All right. I am rather looking forward to this analysis.